Gen Z is facing what many are calling a job apocalypse. Entry-level postings in the US have fallen by around 30% in the past 2 years as companies pull back on hiring junior workers. Youth unemployment has climbed as high as 10.8%, one of the highest rates for young Americans in over a decade. And even when jobs do exist, the bar to get them is much higher. Over a third of US entry-level roles now prefer 3 or more years of experience. However, Gen Z isn't the only young generation to have faced a tough job market, so I wanted to compare it with past generations to really see who had it better or worse historically. I looked at a lot of data and the answer is probably not what you think. Baby boomers entered the workforce under entry-level conditions that were, by historical standards, remarkable. The transition from school to work was supported by an economic structure in which education, housing, and early career employment aligned to create a predictable path into financial stability. The middle class began to flourish along with productivity and GDP. College and university costs were also quite low. In 1970, average annual tuition at a public 4-year university was under $400. That's equivalent to roughly $3,000 to $4,000 today. This made it possible for students to finance their own education through part-time work without dependence on these long-term loans. For a young worker, graduating without long-term payment obligations accelerated both household formation and early savings. Housing affordability reinforced these conditions. In the early 1970s, the median home price was roughly 3.5 to 4 times the median household income. This ratio made home ownership reachable for workers early in their careers, even on a single income. Entry-level employees who maintained steady employment could expect to purchase a home within the first few years of working, which sort of immediately gave them a financial anchor. The labor market provided broad accessibility. Entry-level roles routinely emphasized employer-led training rather than pre-existing experience. Many stable, well-paying positions in manufacturing, clerical work, transportation, government were open to applicants with only a high school diploma. A college degree, when pursued, reliably elevated applicants into professions with clear advancement paths. Companies tended to take more responsibility for developing early career talent, and the majority of job postings reflected that philosophy. Wage conditions further strengthened the early career outlook. Through the early 1970s, wage growth tracked productivity growth pretty closely, allowing new entrants to experience tangible year-over-year progress. A worker's early earnings were sufficient to build savings, qualify for credit, and support household formation. The link between time in the workforce and rising financial security was fairly direct and widely observed. Benefits expanded the value of even modest starting salaries. Defined benefit pensions were common across major employers and provided guaranteed retirement income tied to tenure rather than market performance. Employer-covered healthcare was standard, and union representation tended to strengthen job security for workers across many industries. These benefits meant that the economic value of an entry-level position extended quite a bit further than its initial wage. However, the early advantages boomers experienced did not fully insulate them from significant economic volatility. The mid-1970s introduced stagflation, which combined high inflation with slow growth and reduced purchasing power. The 1973 oil crisis caused substantial economic disruption, and certain sectors experienced layoffs. The early 1980s brought very high interest rates and a recession, and there was difficulties for borrowers because of the slowing economic activity. These challenges were substantial and had meaningful effects on many workers. The timing of these disruptions made a critical difference, though. By the time that stagflation and the early 1980s recession emerged, many boomers had already established their careers, they'd purchased homes, they'd secured roles with strong benefits. Their entry-level conditions had already provided them with economic stability before these sort of shocks occurred. As a result, even during periods of turbulence, the foundational structure of their early working years remained intact. For boomers, the entry-level landscape that included low education costs, accessible housing, employer-supported training, aligned wage growth, and a comprehensive benefits package, it formed a fairly strong foundation. Later economic challenges were absolutely real, but they generally arrived after they sort of had things in place. This combination created one of the more favorable entry-level environments of any generation in the modern American labor market. Gen X entered the workforce during a period marked by significant economic volatility and structural change. Their early careers were influenced by recessions, shifting industries, and the beginning of long-term transformations in employer expectations. Compared to boomers, Gen X faced a more uneven and competitive entry-level environment. The early 1980s recession that we just touched on set the tone for many younger Gen X workers. In 1982, the national unemployment rate reached 10.8%, which was the highest level since the 1930s. Youth unemployment was even higher, and in several months reached as high as 17%. New entrants encountered hiring freezes across manufacturing, construction, and energy. The number of available openings contracted sharply, and job searches took a lot longer than they had in the previous era. Education costs also accelerated during this period. Between 1980 and 1990, the average public university tuition rose by roughly 120%, far outpacing inflation. By 1990, the average annual tuition had climbed to approximately $3,800, which was a lot higher than the few $100s per year in the early 70s. Student loan uptake increased significantly. For many Gen X workers, starting a career meant carrying initial debt burdens that earlier generations didn't really have to contend with. The labor market itself was undergoing a structural contraction. From 1979 to 1984, the United States lost millions of manufacturing jobs. These were roles that had once functioned as reliable entry points for younger workers without degrees. By the mid-1990s, manufacturing's share of total employment had fallen to around 16%, which was down from nearly 25% 2 decades earlier, which represents a 36% drop in share. This decline definitely reshaped the pathways available to new workers, and it reduced access to well-paid, stable jobs. Wage growth also started to slow relative to productivity. From the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s, productivity increased by more than 40%, while real wages for most entry-level workers were largely flat. A young Gen X employee often earned wages similar to those earned by early boomers, but faced higher costs for education and had slower progression. The link between rising national output and rising individual income weakened during this period. Employer expectations also started to shift. Companies began reducing investment in long-term training programs, and entry-level roles increasingly required some prior experience or technical skills. By the early 1990s, job postings in fields like information technology, engineering, and business services more frequently listed specific software or analytical competencies as baseline requirements. New workers found themselves competing with older applicants who had stronger resumes, even for roles that previously weren't considered specialized. And then there's the whole .com thing. Gen X workers who entered the labor force during the mid to late 1990s initially benefited from rapid job creation in tech and related sectors. Between 1995 and 2000, tech employment expanded by millions of jobs, and equity compensation became more common. I mean, millionaires were literally minted left, right, and center. And then, well,
it's described as nothing short of breathtaking, a points drop never before seen on the US market.
Other economic news tonight, there is a new victim of the falling fortunes of the new economy. Pets.com is closing down. Pets.com will sell off the majority of its assets and lay off 255 of its 320 employees.
The NASDAQ fell by nearly 80%, and more than $1 trillion in market value evaporated. Tech layoffs surged, and early career workers in affected industries faced job losses, stalled advancement, and extended periods of instability. Now, it wasn't all bad. Certain advantages remained in place compared to later generations. Housing affordability, while tightening, had not yet reached concerning levels. In 1990, the median home price was approximately 4.2 times the median income, a noticeable increase from the boomer era, but still below the ratios of millennials and Gen Z, as we're going to get into. Employer-provided healthcare was still widely accessible, and while defined benefit pensions were declining, they had not fully disappeared. Gen X entered the workforce at a time when early career stability was no longer guaranteed. At the same time, the structural barriers they faced were not as severe as those encountered by millennials and Gen Z. Their entry-level experience occupied a transitional space between the stability of the boomer era and the heightened constraints of the decades that followed. Millennials entered the workforce during one of the most difficult and structurally constrained entry-level environments in modern US history. Their early careers were shaped by the Great Recession, unprecedented student debt levels, wage stagnation, rising housing costs, and a labor market that demanded experience they did not have yet. Compared to boomers and Gen X, millennials faced an enormously difficult start to their career at the very moment they attempted to begin their working lives. The timing of their entry into the labor market played a defining role. The global financial crisis, which began in late 2007, produced the steepest economic downturn since the 1930s. In 2009, the overall unemployment rate reached 10%, but conditions for younger workers were far worse. Unemployment for workers aged 20 to 24 exceeded 17%, while underemployment rates for recent graduates climbed to above 40%. For millions of millennials, the first years of their career coincided with hiring freezes, mass layoffs, and a collapse in entry-level openings, across nearly every sector. Student debt became a structural barrier for the first time in American history. By 2010, average student loan balances reached over $20,000 per borrower. Tuition costs at public universities had more than tripled between 1990 and 2010. The shift from grants to loans was decisive. Many millennials began their careers with monthly debt payments that limited savings, delayed household formation, and restricted geographic mobility. This burden persisted even for those who secured full-time employment. Wage growth stalled. After adjusting for inflation, millennial entry-level wages in the early 2010s was roughly equivalent to those earned by younger workers in the early 1980s. Career progression was frequently slow, and opportunities for rapid wage increases were less common than they had been for earlier generations. Housing affordability became a legitimate issue, making home ownership increasingly out of reach for early career workers. After the housing crash, prices fell, but credit tightened and lenders imposed much stricter requirements. Millennials encountered a market where qualifying for a mortgage often required strong credit, sizable down payment, and stable employment. Safe to say that was pretty rare among young workers in the post-recession years. The labor market also introduced new structural challenges. As companies adopted digital tools and leaner staffing models, entry-level roles began to require specialized skills and direct experience. Employers continually favored candidates with internships, certifications, or previous industry exposure, even for junior positions. The expectation that a company would train inexperienced workers diminished. Internships, often unpaid, became widespread, and many millennials cycled through temporary or contract roles before securing a full-time job. The rise of precarious work arrangements, including part-time and gig employment, further complicated early career development. Recovery from the recession did not translate into immediate improvement. For much of the 2010s, wage growth remained slow, and the labor force participation for younger workers lagged behind historical norms. Many millennials did not regain the lost earnings from their delayed or disrupted entry into the labor market. Studies later showed that graduating during a recession can reduce lifetime earnings, and this effect was widely observed among this group. Despite these difficulties, millennials experienced certain advantages that differentiated their early careers from those of Gen Z. Remote work was not yet widespread, but technology provided new avenues for skill development and side income. Online education expanded, and digital industries created entirely new career paths in fields such as software development, digital marketing, and e-commerce. These opportunities did not negate the challenges they faced, but offered alternative routes to advancement for those able to access them. Millennials enter the workforce amid severe economic disruption, high debt burdens, rising living costs, and a labor market that demanded experience they had limited opportunities to gain. Their early careers were frequently delayed, derailed, and reshaped by forces well beyond their control. Compared to boomers and Gen X, their entry-level conditions were much more challenging and less predictable. But as we know, they were also at the beginning of one of the longest-running, most spectacular bull markets in history. And should they have weathered the storm, prosperity was in store for the next decade and change. Now, Gen Z. Gen Z has entered the workforce during a period that, again, many commentators describe as a job apocalypse. In formal economic terms, this environment reflects a structural breakdown in the traditional entry-level pathway that supported boomers, Gen X, and even millennials. These include declining labor demand for inexperienced workers, rising credential requirements, the automation of routine tasks due to AI, and a widening mismatch between early career skills and employer expectations. Together, these shifts have created one of the most restrictive entry-level environments in modern history. I call it the Great Squeeze. It's a little less doomy than the apocalypse thing, but you can use whatever term you wish. A defining feature of this environment is the reduction in true entry-level roles. Since the early 2020s, entry-level postings in the United States have fallen by about 30%. This contraction is not mirrored in earlier generations. Boomers entered during periods of departmental expansion and robust employer-funded training. Gen X faced recessions and sectorial decline, but still encountered large pools of accessible roles in manufacturing, clerical work, and government. Millennials entered during a deep economic shock, as we just went over, but post-recession hiring eventually recovered and junior roles expanded through the 2010s. For Gen Z, the reduction in openings has persisted even during years officially characterized as economic stability, signaling a structural shift rather than a cyclical downturn. Experience inflation further defines this environment. A study last year found approximately 38% of jobs labeled as entry-level required at least 3 years of prior experience. This level of requirement did not exist for boomers, who were routinely trained on the job. It was less prominent for Gen X, who saw rising skill requirements but still benefited from employer-led development programs. Millennials experienced growing credential demands for sure, but majority of entry-level roles did not impose multi-year experience thresholds. Gen Z now competes for junior roles that assume prior exposure to professional tools, workflows, and responsibilities that they've probably had very limited opportunity to acquire. Surveys reflect this misalignment. Around 70% of job seekers report that entry-level roles require experience or technical competencies that are just unrealistic for new graduates. These shifts interact with significant economic pressures. Housing affordability now reflects some of the most challenging conditions ever. In many regions, the median home price equals 7 to 10 times median income, compared to ratios closer to 4 for boomers and ratios between 4 and 5 for Gen X during much of the 90s. Rent burdens have reached levels in which younger workers routinely spend 40 to 50% of their income on housing. These pressures limit geographic mobility, delay household formation, and raise the cost of pursuing early career opportunities, particularly in high opportunity regions. Education costs contribute to the challenge. Average in-state tuition at public universities now exceeds $10,000 per year, far above the levels of previous generations. Many Gen Z workers start their careers with monthly loan payments that are very restrictive on their savings and reduce flexibility during the first years of their employment. This stands in contrast to earlier generations who often began their careers with manageable or somewhat minimal debt. And of course, AI. Automation and artificial intelligence have absorbed many of the routine responsibilities that historically functioned as training grounds for inexperienced workers. Tasks related to data entry, basic analysis, customer support, administrative assistance, and early-stage research have either been consolidated or reassigned to software systems. Boomers relied on these tasks to build competence. Gen X and Millennials used them as stepping stones into mid and higher level work. Gen Z faces a labor market where these stepping stones are far less available, though that might just mean that the entry-level role itself is evolving. It's going to take quite a while for the market to adjust to that reality regardless. Wage growth has continued to not match the rising costs associated with education, housing, and transportation. This stands in contrast to earlier generations who generally experience a bit stronger wage progression in the first decade of their work. Now, Gen Z does benefit from opportunities that earlier generations obviously did not have, and I do not want that to be missed here. Remote work expands access to employers across regions. Digital skill development is widely available at low cost. Entrepreneurship, including things like online contracting or content-based income, is more accessible. The internet is functionally a money-making machine, and while many may roll their eyes at that sentiment, the thought of being able to earn a living with just a laptop, cell phone, and Wi-Fi connection is something of dreams of previous generations, and it's something that you cannot ignore as an advantage of today's era. These avenues provide alternatives to traditional corporate pathways and can offset some of the challenges of the formal labor market. Even with some of these advantages, the structural conditions surrounding entry-level employment for Gen Z, it remains among the most complex and restrictive of modern US history. So who had it better? When you look at boomers and you look at Gen Z and the market that they have for entry level, of course, there's other things beyond this video that were extremely challenging during this era that would have maybe made entry level work quite hard. But when you look at just economic data in terms of favorability for entry level work then versus today, I would say it's a little bit harder today, to say the least. When you compare that period to Gen X, of course, Gen X, tons of issues, recessions, tough economic environments, stuff that we didn't even get to go over in this video that they had to deal with. Certainly a tough environment, but wasn't as trying as I would say today is based on the economic data. Again, we're just keeping it to the economics. But when you look at Gen Z versus Millennial, that's when you can make a extremely compelling argument for both to say they are some of the more challenging ever. I could sit here and pick a winner, but I just think both are very, very difficult for varying different reasons. The thing about 08 though, that was a proper recession. Like people were losing their homes and jobs, and it was a full on like financial meltdown. Like the entire financial world was falling apart. You can't say that it's currently happening right now. But again, it is a different type of difficult, right? It's not a big broad shock. It's a sort of squeeze that's happening over a longer period of time. So it's hard to go apples to apples on it. I think it's fair to say that both have been quite challenging for varying reasons. There's one more thing we need to talk about with regards to the Gen Z job market. There's still hope. Even with a more narrow entry-level system, the Gen Z job market story is not over yet. The environment is certainly more constrained, but it also contains new economic channels that earlier generations, again, did not have access to. Gen Z does have the ability to apply for roles nationwide rather than being limited to their local market, which Yes, everybody has that availability now, but it is something to be mentioned because it dramatically increases the number of potential employers available to early career workers should things tick up economically. Also, more than half of Gen Z adults report learning job-related skills from online sources. This is a level significantly higher than millennials at the same age. The ability to upscale quickly gives them more direct control over how competitive they are in the job market. And one of the most significant shifts again is internet commerce. Online retail now accounts for roughly 15% of all US retail sales compared to less than 2% in the early 2000s. This expansion has created millions of roles and business opportunities across logistics, advertising, product design, content creation, and online storefront management. Gen Z enters the workforce at a time when individuals can build businesses on platforms like Shopify, Amazon, Etsy, and social marketplaces without the startup costs that prevented earlier generations from participating commerce. Freelancing and contracting have also grown substantially as well. Roughly 64 million Americans now earn income through independent work, a figure that has doubled since the early 2010s. These platforms allow Gen Z to build portfolios, generate income, and gain real-world experience even when full-time corporate roles are limited. Earlier generations had far fewer mechanisms to monetize skills on a project-by-project basis. And content creation, as you're seeing, and online influence represent another commercial channel. More than 50 million people now participate in some form of content-driven income. Gen Z is the first cohort to enter adulthood with access to monetize digital platforms from day one, giving them a direct path to build audiences, promote products, or develop personal brands that lead to paid opportunities. Also, the modern economy rewards adaptability at a scale that aligns with Gen Z's strengths. Today's fastest growing roles include data analysts, software developers, logistics planners, and digital marketers. These are fields where skills can be built online, portfolios can be developed independently, and employers are frequently starting to evaluate output over credentials. The constraints that Gen Z faces are extremely real, but they coexist with new forms of mobility. Remote work expands their reach, online learning expands capability, the internet expands income potential, and digital commerce expands the number of markets they can participate in. The traditional entry-level ladder may be narrower and changing altogether, but multiple new ladders may now be available. Each one offers a pathway to stability and advancement that earlier generations could never have even dreamed of having at their disposal. I say this a lot in my videos because I don't want to sugarcoat the data. The data is what it is. It is a tough entry-level market. But time after time after time, anecdotally, I'm coming across some of the most remarkable people I've ever met, and they're all Gen Z, all inspirational, all super ambitious, all creating opportunities that you can't even comprehend how they're doing it, how they're getting these new roles, how they're working with companies. Maybe they're operating more on a contractor basis and they're doing more client work. Maybe they're coming out of school with different competencies that are more in demand, like machine learning. And I know anecdotes only go so far, but it makes me super excited and super hopeful for the future. If anybody's going to figure out this market, I know it's this generation.